to be commemorating every weekend until Arba'in, the sacrifice of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Please send a loud salawat. In these 2 nights specifically, we will be commemorating the passing of, we will be commemorating Imam Zain al-Abidin. And as you all know, Imam Zain al-Abidin lived through the tragedy of Karbala, but he used his experiences from that tragedy to elevate his worship and then the worship of the Shia as well. And one way that we can actually connect with that worship is through his collection of du'as, Sahifa Sajjadiyya. So a few quick reminders. One is that we have water available. We have water bottles, but we're also transitioning to everyone bringing their own bottles so that we can, inshallah, conserve, not waste plastic, and it's better for the environment, inshallah. So we will begin, inshallah, with recitation of Quran, as we do with all of our programs. So I would like to welcome Brother Zain Hassan to recite for us tonight, inshallah. I'm sorry, Zain Hussain. I'm sorry, Imam. Please give him a loud salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين حتى تأتيهم البينة رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة فيها كتب قيمة وما تفرق الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءتهم البينة وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا الله مخلصين له الدين حنفاء يقيموا الصلاة ويؤتوا الزكاة وذلك دين القيمة إن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين في نار جهنم خالدين فيها أولئك هم شر البرية إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات أولئك هم خير البرية جزاؤهم عند ربهم جنات عدن تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه ذلك لمن خشي ربه صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Now I'll be reading the translation of Surah Bayyinah, which means the clear evidence. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate and the most merciful. Those who reject the truth among the people of the book and among the polytheists were not going to depart from their ways until there should come to them clear evidence and a messenger from Allah, rehearsing scriptures kept pure and holy, wherein are laws or decrees right and straight. Nor did the people of the book make schemes until after there came to them clear evidence. And they have been commanded no more than this, to worship Allah, offering Him sincere devotion, being true in faith, to establish regular prayer, and to practice regular charity, and that is the religion right and straight. Those who reject the truth among the people of the book and among the polytheists will be in the hellfire, to dwell therein. They are the worst of creatures. Those who have faith and do righteous deeds, they are the best of creatures. Their reward is with Allah, gardens of eternity, beneath which rivers flow. They will dwell there forever. Allah well pleased with them, and they with Him. All this for such as fear their Lord and cherisher. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. Salawat.
Thank you both for the beautiful recitation and for reading from the translation for us. Before moving on, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors for tonight's program. So tonight, our sponsors are the Hayat and Kashmipur families, Sister Latifa Barnett, Farouk Mays, Nzinga Aziz, and Hussain Akil. Please recite a Fatiha for all of their marhumin, who I will read in one moment. So Sister Shakura Abdul Samad, who, by the way, today is the third anniversary of her passing. Aisha Al-Makki, Ivy and Kelvin Barnett, Missouri Lyde, Batul Ansari, Saad Begum, Shafi'a Begum, and Rajwali Saad. Please recite a salawat and a Fatiha for them. And so we've also had an accident in the community. All of you probably know Khurshid Auntie, who is one of the very dedicated volunteers here, and Sayyid Suleiman's mother. So she just had a surgery, and I would like to request that we all recite Amma Yujib for her 5 times for her quick and speedy recovery, inshallah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 صلوات على محمد وآله. Next, I would like to invite Muhammad Ibrahim, who will be reciting some poetry for us. Please welcome him with a loud salawat.
Salawat. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. From the plain of Karbala, you were dragged so far, shackled with wicked chains, inflicted with such pain, never eyes could see how they tortured thee, how blood fell on your hand amid the sweltering sand. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. For what crime were you taken there? How could they be so unfair? Your crime was to go for Islam, for the benefit of man. They dragged you from town to town. They strive to bring you down. They tried to break your will, and in your mind did peace instill. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. In the court of cursed Yazid, attacked you they surely did. Zainab protected you, as your illness weakened you. To fight another day was the only way to save the message of Allah. You surely suffered so. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. For years oppression would stand, forgot in that wicked land. O loathsome Karbala, where innocents murdered were. No place was ever safe for the Ahlul Bayt. So lonely, abandoned you stood, for the sake of good. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. O Zain al-Abidin, sweet Zain al-Abidin, forever tears will flow, for you suffered so. Salawat.
Thank you, Muhammad, for sharing that beautiful poetry with us. Now we're going to move on to the lecture portion of our program tonight. So for the next 2 nights, we have the honor of hearing from our esteemed scholar, Shaykh Reza Himyari. Shaykh Reza was born in Iran and raised in the Northern Virginia area. He began his Hausa studies in Najaf, Iraq, and continued his studies at the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. He is currently a PhD student in Islamic Studies at the University of Chicago. Please welcome him with the loudest of your salawats.
الفاتحة. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلق أجمعين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى يوم الدين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الذين اتقوا إذا مسهم طائف من الشيطان تذكروا فإذا هم مبصرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. Dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an honor to be amongst you on these days of the anniversary of the Shahadat, the death of Imam Zainul Abidin, Sayyid al-Sajjadin, Ali ibn al-Hussain alayhi salam. Salawat. And we take these opportunities to reflect on the legacy of our Ahlul Bayt. There are many things that we can derive from these majalis. And one is to try to reflect the characters and the morals, and to think about, take a moment to think about what was the legacy, what was the thing that the Ahlul Bayt left for us. One of the most beautiful khutab by our fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin, was a khutbah that is said the Imam would recite every Friday for not just his followers, not just the Shia or the Ashab of that Imam, but the hadith itself. It is narrated that the Imam would say, Ya Bani Adam, O people, O children of Adam. So it is an address to all people, not just even the people of the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, but throughout time. This is a hadith, it's a khutbah that's been reported. The Imam would talk about Taqwa, talk about Zuhd. Mentioned this earlier today in Salatul Jum'ah. One of those segments of that khutbah of Imam Zainul Abidin is where the Imam recites these ayat of Suratul Anbiya. The Imam says that Allah in Surat Anbiya, He gives us an account of people who Allah destroys, He obliterates. He says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. This is ayah number 11 of Surat Al-Anbiya, and the Imam doesn't just stop at this one ayah. The ayah says, كَمْ قَسَمْنَا مِنْ قَرْيَةٍ كَانَتْ ظَالِمَةً وَأَنْشَأْنَا بَعْدَهَا قَوْمًا آخَرِينَ. How many people, how many towns did we destroy, and then we replaced them with another people? Allah continues, He says, and these people, these towns that we would destroy, they would flee. They would try to separate themselves from that destruction that Allah is bringing upon them, that punishment in this world that Allah is making them face. And they try to flee. And then Allah tells them, He says, return back to those houses, those lives that you led, that wealth and that power that you were able to acquire for yourself, which you used to go against my word and the word of my messengers. And then Allah says, because you will be accounted for all of those things that you did in those places. There's no place to flee. When the punishment of Allah descends upon a people, Allah says there's nowhere to flee. Allah knows His lands. And so He knows where you're going to go. And that punishment is not something that you can avoid. And then the Imam says, these people, or rather the ayah continues, says, قَالُوا يَا وَيْلَنَا إِنَّا كُنَّا ظَالِمِينَ. These people, when they are faced with the punishment of Allah, they say, woe upon us, إِنَّا كُنَّا ظَالِمِينَ. They realize that injustice that they had done themselves, that injustice that they had wrought by their own hands. They have this realization. They're forced to reflect. Inna kunna dhalimin. The Imam says to, again, in this khutbah that he would recite on Jum'ahs, he would say that, don't think, again, this is to his audience, was the city of Medina, the place of the prophets, the city of the Prophet of Islam. And so the people who were listening to the Imam were Muslims. They weren't kuffar, they weren't mushrikeen. This is 60, 70 years after the Prophet had come to the city of Medina. And so the Imam says, don't think, Imam Sajjad, he says, don't think that these ayat are about the mushrikeen. These are not talking about the polytheists before Islam. The surface of the ayah seems like it's referring to people who were destroyed before Islam had come, towns that Allah destroyed before the coming of Islam. But the Imam Sajjad says, don't think that this ayah is talking about the mushrikeen. Because the mushrikeen who heard the words of the Prophet, but then rejected them outright, they don't have a scales. They don't have, Allah does not bring them into His court even. He punishes them and He sends them to the hellfire straight away, without any sort of moment to give them any appeal. The Imam says, these ayat of Surah Al-Anbiya are talking about the Muslims. Think about how many people were destroyed, how many towns we obliterated, and the people come and say, Inna kunna dhalimin. We were, and we are, unjust, evildoers. The Imam says, this ayah is talking about people who hear the message of the Prophet, who understand and maybe on some level accept that message, but then they have this realization that at some point they have become amongst the dhalimeen. The Imam points to an ayah that comes later in Surah Al-Anbiya. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وَنَضَعُ الْمَوَازِينَ الْقِسْطَ لِيَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ وَلَا تُظْلَمُ نَفْسٌ شَيْئًا. And we will establish scales, and we will establish a judgment, a court, for the people to come on the day of judgment. And there's not a single soul that is going to feel any sort of injustice in that court. Allah's court is filled with justice. It is established based on Allah's justice. And so if we think as Muslims that these ayat are referring to other people, that another people is going to come in the court of Allah, then we are fooling ourselves. Allah establishes His court for those who do good and who do evil. He establishes the scales. If a person does evil his entire life, there's no need for scales anymore. There's no need for a judgment. That person knows himself or herself. They know that they are unjust. Scales Judgment is for a person who's not sure. Or even if he is sure, he has fooled others. So others might think that this is a virtuous person. This is a Muslim who abides by the tenets of Islam. This message of Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, Salu ala Muhammad wa ala. It points to a principle in Quranic tafsir. When we're reading the Quran, sometimes we think that we're reading, when it talks about Bani Israel, or it talks about the Nasara, talks about Qawm Ad or Thamud, these previous past qawms or aqwam, these people who died many, many centuries or even millennia ago. Sometimes we think we're reading a storybook, or maybe a book of history. We think that these are people who've passed, don't really apply to us. Maybe we can kind of take some lesson from the lives of these people, but we don't realize, according to the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, that these are simply metaphors. These stories and this history of the Quran is actually talking about us. It is ultimately relevant to us. And this is one of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. There is a hadith of our fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, wherein the Imam says that the ayat of the Quran continue. Yajri awwaluha ala akhiriha. It flows like a river. The ayat of the Quran flow from its beginning, its source, the moment in which it was revealed, until the very end. Kama tajri as-samawatu wal-ard. Just as the nights and the day, the heavens and the earth continue, that celestial realm, the physical world continues, the moral universe of Allah continues as well. The principles of the Quran talk and tell us about the moral universe. So that moral universe as well continues from the beginning of time until the end of time. And then Imam Baqir says that a people, whichever people, and of course this is talking about the Muslims, those people who recite the Quran and who reflect upon the Quran. لِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ آيَةٌ. There is an ayah that applies to every qawm, every people. This qawm is at any moment in Islamic history. Rather, at any moment in human history, there is an ayah that applies to that people. لِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ آيَةٌ يَتْلُونَهَا. And those people recite that ayah. They recite it. They know it. Maybe they've even memorized those ayat. The Imam says, and there is an ayah that applies to every people. That's not just that they read it, but it applies to them. Meaning, when we want to read the Quran, we have to think about, when we're reading either the Arabic, if we are familiar with Arabic, or the translation. When we read the Quran, part of our mission, part of our task, is not to just recite the Quran and be done with it. Of course, the Quran has many different benefits. We recite it when we are born, we recite it when we die. We recite it every single day throughout our life. Sometimes parts of the Quran have even physical benefits for us. Right? We sometimes wear parts of the Quran. We maybe even recite Ayatul Kursi to be safe in our travels, or other ayat to secure us and to save us in our travels. So there are various benefits. If we're trying to understand the meaning of the Quran, when we're reading it and we're reading the translation, one of our tasks is to read the ayahs of the Quran and see which ayah applies to us. Does this ayah that talks about the muttaqeen apply to me? Or is it this ayah that talks about the munafiqeen? Does that ayah apply to me? Not just on an individual level. Sometimes we think about ourselves as individuals, and sometimes we think of ourselves as a community or as a society. Which ayah applies to my society? If we read the Quran in that way, it doesn't stop us when we look at, for example, the stories of Bani Israel. What Imam Sajjad is telling us is that sometimes when we read the stories of Bani Israel, the story of Bani Israel applies more to us than it does to Bani Israel. When these people are fleeing away from that punishment that Allah is sending to them, He is eradicating their town. And then they come to this realization. قَالُوا إِنَّا كُنَّا ظَالِمِينَ. Imam Sajjad is saying that this might apply to my qawm, my qarya, my town, and my people, more than it applied to somebody in the past. Because I fulfill those realities, I have manifested those realities in myself more than those people manifested them before me. What do I mean? When we think about the ayats of the Quran, sometimes we think about them in terms of the words. Again, there are various approaches that Mufassirun take when it comes to the Quran. We think about words, right? For example, let me give you an example of a flower. I write the word flower on a piece of paper. It's a word, and it refers not to itself, but it refers to something else. It refers to something out in the world. Sometimes I might draw a picture of this flower, and it might be a beautiful picture. I don't draw well, maybe some of you do, but it might be, a rose that you draw, a beautiful red rose. Now this red rose, you might take some benefit or you might take some kind of pleasure, both in the drawing and in reflecting on that drawing. But that rose ultimately itself is as well pointing to something else. I don't draw a rose because I, for example, have thought about it and I've created it in my mind. I draw a rose as a representation of something that exists in the real world. Now, there's a difference between the writing of a rose or a flower, the drawing of a rose and a flower, and the actual flower in the real world, right? This is something that we experience. When we come to the drawing, we can't smell the rose. We can only see it. We can't touch the rose. We can only see it. But when we come to the actual rose in the real world, not only can we touch it, not only can we enjoy it and see it, but as well we can smell it, we can destroy it, we can put it in some water and it can flourish, we can even plant it and it can grow and grow and grow. The real world, real things out in the real world, they have a depth. They have various dimensions. They have various benefits to us and could even harm us. A rose has thorns. So something in the real world can benefit us and it can harm us. That drawing can't harm me. I can't prick my finger from that drawing. When we think about the real world, there are various dimensions to the real world, to something that exists out in reality. When we think about taqwa, there's this ayat that I began in Surah al-A'raf, ayah number 201. Allah says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا إِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِّنَ الشَّيْطَانِ تَذَكَّرُوا فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ. When we think about taqwa, sometimes we think about it in terms of words on a page. This is taqwa, and these are the descriptions that we can give or that have been given in the Quran. So I look in the Quran and I see how did Allah explain taqwa in this ayah, Surah Al-Baqarah, in this ayah, in Surah Al-A'raf, and in various other ayat. Allah says that those who are muttaqi, who are aware and conscious of Allah, who fear Allah, they are a people when some sort of inclination or some sort of temptation from shaitan comes and afflicts them. إِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِّنَ الشَّيْطَانِ تَذَكَّرُوا. They remember Allah. فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ. And they are seeing. They are insightful. There are people who have their eyes open. Their eyes have not been closed by Allah nor by themselves. We think about the description of the muttaqeen in the Quran. That's one level. Sometimes you might think about the description of the muttaqeen in our mind. What does taqwa mean? What is it talking about? What is it referring to? So we say, for example, taqwa is a consciousness of Allah, being aware of Allah, such that I see, for example, Allah. It is as though, just like how I see all of you in front of me, I am conscious and aware of you. I don't want to make any mistakes. I don't want to, for example, have any slip-ups. Just like how I fear making any mistakes in front of you, and I'm conscious and I'm aware of your existence. So that we have to be aware of Allah's existence. If I want to be a muttaqi, taqwa is being aware of Allah's existence even more so than people in front of me. I have to be aware of the source of my creation. That's what taqwa is in my mind. That's the definition of taqwa. If I look it up in the dictionary, that's what it refers to. But then I said, there's one level where you have something written on a page. That's one level of existence. Another level wherein you think about it maybe in your mind, or maybe even you produce something and you draw something. That's another level of existence. There's a different level, however, when you think about it in the real world. When you experience it, when you see it in real life, when you touch that rose, or you smell it. What is taqwa in the real world? Allah says throughout the Quran, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا. Those who are muttaqi, those who have taqwa. If you want to think about the reality, the real existence of taqwa, you have to look at it in terms of certain people. You have to look at it in terms of a real human being's life. A person who is conscious of Allah. When I look at, for example, the lives of the Ahlul Bayt, I see taqwa as a reference to those people. I said a rose has color. It could be a red rose or a white rose. That's one dimension of the existence of a rose. It has thorns. It has a fragrance. I look at the life and the reality of a human being. If I look at that life, I can look at one dimension of that person's being, that person's character, that person's consciousness and conscience. And I see that that person is muttaqi. I see taqwa in real life, not just as a concept in my mind, but how it plays out in the real world. Taqwa is referring me to people who are conscious of Allah, who are fully aware and fearful of Allah. That's what we are seeking. We're seeking certain people who have worked on their soul to such an extent that their eyes are open. فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ. Their eyes are open to the realities of Allah's creation. Their eyes are open to their own existence, where they come from. A person with his eyes open, he sees things in the real world. He sees things as they are. He's not blinded by himself or by those things that surround him. So that's what we're looking for. Now, let's come back to the life and the legacy of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. When we think about the legacy of Imam Sajjad, we have to think about the legacy of the Ahlul Bayt in terms of their context. We want to understand the words of the Ahlul Bayt We get a deeper insight into their words when we look at their historical context. And of course, we can't really understand the contribution of Imam Sajjad unless we look at the events of Karbala. We look at the message and the legacy of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now, when we think about the legacy of Imam Hussain, sometimes we think about the legacy of Imam Hussain or the events of Karbala in terms of Imam Hussein's rising up against a person like Yazid, against an oppressor, a usurper of the Khilafat of Rasulullah by the name of Yazid. And so sometimes we think about how Imam Hussain received letters from the people of Kufa, and then the Imam responded, and then he set his path towards Karbala, and then the Imam was martyred along with his companions in the plains of Karbala. And of course, this is the history of what happened. The Imam was called to give bay'ah to Yazid. The Imam refused, and then he set on his journey towards Karbala. But when we think about the message of Imam Hussain, we don't think about the message of Imam Hussain if we really look at the history of the Imam's journey. We shouldn't think about it simply in terms of some uprising against a usurper. That is one aspect of it. One dimension of the rising up of Imam Hussain was that he was not willing to give bay'ah to a person like Yazid. And that's true. But we really have to understand the mission of Imam Hussain, we have to understand what was Imam Hussain doing in terms of the legacy of the Prophet. Again, we have to read the words of the Quran in terms of how it applies to our lives and the history of the Muslims. When we look at the accounts of Karbala, before Imam Hussain reached the plains of Karbala, and even when he reached those plains, we see that the Imam was continuously calling people towards what had the Banu Israel done. What's interesting is that before Imam Hussain set on his journey, he was told by the companions, don't rise up against Yazid. Yes, he is an evil person, but don't cause this conflict and this chaos amongst the Muslims. Imam Hussein's response was not that I have to do this because politically there is a problem amongst the Muslims, which there was, or that socially there was a problem, which there was. What the Imam says is that think about the actions of Bani Israel. The Quran talks about this. Bani Israel killed tens of the anbiya that Allah sent, the messengers that Allah sent. And they would even kill Yahya, that's prophet of Allah, that the Quran itself talks about. And they would cut off his head. And they would give this head of Nabi Yahya to each other as a gift. They would kill all of these prophets, and then they would go and sit in their markets as though nothing had happened. The Imam is telling the people of the Muslim Ummah, don't think of this simply as an aberration. This is that same story that has been continuing from the times of the prophets until now, where a prophet comes and the message of that prophet is forgotten. And so time and time again, the Imam says, don't think of Yazid simply as a usurper. Don't think of his role simply as a political leader. But he is creating a society which is forgetting that message of the Prophet, forgetting the message of Rasulullah. That was the mission of Imam Hussain. There was a people who had come, and a messenger had come with the revelation of Allah. And these people, once that messenger leaves, they forget on purpose and because of the dictates of their lives, they would forget that message of the Prophet. And they would even kill the legacy of that Prophet, both literally and metaphorically. That is the message of Imam Hussain. When we look in the historical record, we see that within just a few years after the death of the Prophet, the values of the Muslim Ummah had totally changed. The death of Imam Hussain was only 50 years after the death of the Prophet. 50 years. That's not even enough for a generation to forget. If a person was 10 or even 15 during the life of the Prophet, they would remember the Prophet. They knew who the Prophet was. They would have survived, and many even of the companions of the Prophet survived until the time of Imam Hussain. Think about what had changed within this Muslim society, that 50 years after the death of the Prophet, they were willing to kill the grandson and the legacy of the Prophet. What had changed? It is said, if we look in history, that simply not even 50 years, just a few years after the death of the Prophet, the values of the Muslims had changed so much that now the Muslims were thinking about expanding. They were thinking about conquering. The companions of the Prophet weren't thinking about taqwa. They weren't thinking about their relationship and their consciousness, their awareness of Allah, their relationship with Allah. They were thinking about how I can get ahead, how I can become the next Khalifa, how I can gain power and prestige and wealth. And so you see, one after another, the companions of the Prophet, again, not 50 years, right after the death of the Prophet, they would begin to think about how I can get ahead, how I can further my own personal goals, my own material goals. And so at one time you see that the companions of the Prophet would go and conquer lands. They would conquer peoples. They would acquire wealth for themselves. They would buy and sell land between themselves. And this would be the sign of prestige amongst the Muslims. That's what people took pride in. That's what they would see their honor in. How much wealth I can gain. Who is going to become the next Khalifa? And then there were certain criteria, of course, they had. And much of these criteria would go back to the same criteria amongst the people before the coming of Islam, before the coming of the Prophet of Islam. So which qabila you were a part of, which tribe you adhered to and you were born in, that was the basis for your advancement in that society. So one after another, we see that time and time again, the khilafat, and not just the khilafat, but the honor and the prestige amongst the Muslims was given in terms of not spiritual power, not taqwa, but in terms of wealth, in terms of power. That's what we see amongst the Banu Umayyah. Sometimes we think that Muawiyah simply was undercutting the name of Amirul Mu'mineen, alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We say that, na'udhu billah, Muawiyah began this custom that lasted for really generations, decades, of cursing Amirul Mu'mineen and cursing the Ahlul Bayt, na'udhu billah. He was trying to erase the memory of the Ahlul Bayt. And this was a custom. This was not just a practice that he would recommend. This was a state policy. That every Jum'ah, every khutbah that a speaker would give, they were required to curse the name of Amirul Mu'mineen. Trying to erase that memory of Imam Ali. Sometimes we think of this as sort of a legacy of the Shia. But we have to think about the legacy of Banu Umayyah and the history of Banu Umayyah in terms of how much they were undercutting the very lessons and teachings of Islam. Amirul Mu'mineen was the ultimate manifestation of taqwa. But Muawiyah was a person who claimed himself not just as a Khalifat Rasulullah, but he becomes now Khalifatullah, a representative of Allah. This is actually one of the changes that Banu Umayyah instilled. They become now Khalifatullah, the representative, the heir of Allah. They become the ultimate representation of Islam. Not just that. He claims for himself, Ana akhirul khalifa wa awwalul muluk. I am the final Khalifa. So think about the representation even of Allah being erased. Wa awwalul muluk. Now I am becoming the first king. And even today, some Muslims take pride in the fact that we have kings within the history of Islam. Kingship, a kingdom. What does kingship and kingdom mean? Think about Sham, Damascus. They were modeling themselves after the Byzantines, after the Roman emperors. People who would do whatever they felt. They would acquire whatever wealth they wanted, subjugate whichever people they had, and that was their source of power and prestige. That's what gave them their honor. Banu Umayyah were modeling themselves after not even the customs of the previous Khulafa. Not to even speak about Rasulullah. They were modeling themselves after the Romans, the Byzantines. That's the legacy of Banu Umayyah. So if you look in the historical record, you see that one after another. First comes the companions, who are forgetting the legacy of the Prophet. Next, we have the Banu Umayyah, who are slowly chipping away at that memory. And then you have even the people. When you have a representation at the highest level of your society, those people who represent your society, they set the standard. They set the values that everybody else adheres to. They set the goal. This is what I want to become. When a child thinks about, for example, what they want to grow up to become, they think about it in terms of who has honor, who has dignity in my society. And so the standard was set, not just by the Banu Umayyah, but even by those people who claimed companionship of Rasulullah. So when we think about the mission of Imam Hussain, we have to think about it in terms of this type of society. The Muslim Ummah was forgetting the legacy of the Prophet. And so, I will try to conclude. When we think about the legacy of Imam Hussain, it's not something that is specific to the Shia or the followers of the Ahlul Bayt. It is a legacy that must be honored by every single Muslim who claims that he is a follower of Rasulullah, Muhammadun Mustafa, sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Anyone who talks about ahadith of Rasulullah, anyone who talks about the teachings of the Quran, anyone who talks about Islam and calls himself a Muslim must honor the memory of Imam Hussain. Because it's through the sacrifice of Imam Hussain that we have any semblance of that memory of Rasulullah. We have any semblance of that teaching of the Prophet of Islam. Otherwise, all of that would have been forgotten. Just takes a moment to reflect upon the history of the Muslims. I gave you some indications of some words from Muawiyah, person who was the first king amongst the Muslims. A people who were not supposed to have kings. They were supposed to have a prophet and a lineage from that prophet, successors to that prophet. When we think about the people who would respond to Imam Hussain. Why was Yazid even in power? We have within the historical record what has been reported to us that it wasn't simply Muawiyah who was making an individual choice. The people of Sham told Muawiyah that this Ahlul Bayt, we can't stand these Ahlul Bayt. These are people who have killed us and our forefathers. And they are people who are going to come and require justice to be spread in this society. And so we can't stand that standard, can't stand that criteria. And so appoint your son Yazid. These are the people of Sham, those noblemen, the nobility of Sham, coming and telling Muawiyah, make Yazid your heir. The next Khalifa, the next king after yourself, appoint Yazid as the next king. It's not just an individual choice. It's a society that is being corrupted at its very core. When we look in the words of Imam Hussain and the response that Imam Hussain was giving to Muawiyah and to Yazid, we see that Imam Hussain was as well talking to the companions. He's making his case to the companions of the Prophet. Muawiyah comes and tells one of the closest companions to the Prophet, I have appointed my son Yazid, and I have made this bay'ah. This is a bay'ah. Think about the superficial, the veneer of Islam, and this is what was happening. They were carving out the very essence of Islam, and they were placing a veneer. I have made a bay'ah. I have forced the Muslims, and the Muslims have now come and gave bay'ah to the next Khalifa. These are terms, bay'ah and Khalifa, these are terms that are evocative and significant amongst the Muslims. You can't break your bay'ah. And so Muawiyah comes and tells this companion, I've had them come and give bay'ah, now they have given bay'ah. What do you say if a person were to come and oppose this bay'ah? What should I do? The companion says, Muawiyah asks, he says, do you think I should maybe change my bay'ah, the bay'ah that the Muslims have given to Yazid? Should I replace Yazid with someone else? Companion says, no, that's not what I think. But just be kind. Just be generous and compassionate towards the people. If a person or if a people come and revolt against you or against Yazid, don't be too harsh. Be kind. That's the response that has been given by the highest level of the Muslims, the people who are supposed to honor the legacy of the Prophet. And this, of course, is being spoken against Imam Hussain. Companions who knew who Imam Hussain was. And so when Imam Hussain leaves from Medina to Mecca, he recounts the story of Nabi Musa. Again, it's the same story. Same Quranic story. Imam Hussain is saying this is the same story. He says when Nabi Musa fled from Egypt, he turns to Allah. He says, قَالَ رَبِّ نَجِّنِي مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. O my Lord, free me and save me from this unjust people. That's what the words of Nabi Musa. Those are the same words that Imam Hussain speaks as he is leaving from the city of Medina. When he leaves the city of Mecca, he says that I am leaving this city because I know these people, this Banu Umayyah and this Yazid, they are not going to leave the haram of Allah untouched. If it comes down to it, they are going to come and attack me, and they're going to shed my blood within the sanctuary of Allah. Now, some Muslims may have denied this, or they may have been unsure. And so they said, don't leave Mecca. Stay here. This is the sanctuary of Allah. And we see that just a few years later, the army of Yazid comes and destroys the Kaaba itself. killing the Muslims within the city of Mecca and Medina. Imam Hussain at every single stage is calling the people not only towards that's legacy of the Prophet, but he is pointing out to whoever is willing to deny it the depth of the evil of the Banu Umayyah, of Yazid and his army. He's pointing it out and he's making it clear. They're going to not stop at any level to get what they want. And so when we think about the journey of Imam Hussain, we think about it in terms of opening up the eyes of the Muslims. This is what you are sacrificing. This is what your values have become, what your hopes and dreams have become, to simply further your own physical and material well-being. That's what you hope for in life. From the top of your society until the very bottom. And so Imam Hussain, as he journeys throughout those lands, he says, and he points time and time again, it doesn't matter whether the people of Kufa are going to fight with me or not. I have to sacrifice myself. I have to open the eyes of these Muslims to show them the depth to which that they have fallen. It's not some other people who is going to come and kill Imam Hussain. Rasulullah himself, Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he has told me, قَدْ أَمَرَنِي جَدِّي, I have been commanded by Rasulullah, by my grandfather. قَدْ أَمَرَنِي جَدِّي بِأَمْرٍ وَأَنَا مَاضٍ فِي. This is the words of Imam Hussain. He has commanded me with a command. And I have just given my life towards that. And so Imam Hussain continues. He says, Umitat as-sunnah. The sunnah of the Prophet has been killed. Wa uhiyat al-bid'ah. And the bid'ah and the destruction of that sunnah has been enlivened, has been rejuvenated amongst the Muslims. That's the legacy of Imam Hussain. Think about it in terms of reviving the very teachings of the Prophet of Islam. Now, when we think about the events of Karbala, the events of Karbala do not end with the death of Imam Hussain, with the martyrdom of Imam Hussain. In fact, when we hear the words of Imam Sajjad, Imam says, he was asked, what was the most difficult moment throughout your journey? He doesn't say it was what happened in Karbala. He says Ash-Sham. Ash-Sham. He says it was that continuation of my journey. Imam Sajjad, the legacy of Imam Sajjad, one of the legacies and one of the teachings of Imam Sajjad, he gives through his tears for Imam Hussain. Through the lamentations that continued after the events of Karbala. And so that's why we see that at every moment, at every stage, that Imam Sajjad and the caravan of Imam Hussain and the caravan of the Ahlul Bayt, wherever they would stop, whether it was in Kufa, after the events of Karbala, or whether it was in Sham, or whether it was back in Medina, when they finally come and return to Medina, we see that time and time again, the Muslims are realizing what had happened. There was no newspapers or internet at that time. The message of Imam Hussain was continuing with the lamentations and the mourning of Imam Zainul Abidin. He was telling them, do you know who you have killed? This is the grandson of the Prophet. Do you know who I am? I am the grandson of that same Prophet. The Muslims had forgotten. When Imam Zainul Abidin, again, is asked, he says, the most difficult moment throughout my journey was Sham, the city of Damascus. For it is part of our legacy as the Ahlul Bayt to reach martyrdom. That's an honor for us. It's not something that we shy away from. But Sham was the moment in which we saw something that we never deserved. Sham was the moment in which we were disgraced and dishonored. When we entered into the city of Sham, we were faced with one dishonor and disrespect after another. It is said that the heads of the martyrs were carried in front of the caravan, so that not only the people of Sham would see who had been vanquished and who had been conquered, but as well the little children of Imam Hussain, and the women, and Imam Zainul Abidin himself would look up and he would see the head of his father. And he would look down and he would see the hands of the little children being bound. And so Imam Zainul Abidin says, Asham, Asham, Asham. Damascus, Sham was the most difficult moment in this journey. When we were taken through the streets and the people didn't know who we were. They thought we were enemies from outside the lands of Islam. We were kuffar, na'udhu billah. And even kuffar, even the mushrikeen would have been welcomed with a different welcome. This army of Yazid would drag us through one marketplace after another, one street after another, and they would celebrate until we were finally taken to the court of Yazid. It is said that in the court of Yazid, Yazid placed the head of Imam Hussain in front of himself. Na'udhu billah, Adam Allah ujurana wa ujurakum. It is said that Yazid would take a stick, he would take a cane, and he would hit the head of Imam Hussain. He would strike the teeth of Imam Hussain in front of the eyes of Lady Zainab. And the children of Imam Hussain would see this. And it is said that the children of Imam Hussain would say, Wa Amma, oh our aunt, oh Zainab, why do we see the head of our father being dishonored in this way? Why is this man doing this to the head of our father? It is said that Imam Zainul Abidin, at one point, he saw the person go up the minbar, and he began to spew curse upon the family of Rasulullah, upon the Ahlul Bayt. He would curse Amirul Mu'mineen, and then he would curse Imam Hussain. And then Imam Sajjad would say, Oh Yazid, tell this man to come down, because I have something to say. You have brought us from each village and each town to this place. Now I want to speak. It is said that a commotion arose within the court of Yazid, and they would say, Let him speak, O Yazid. The people were beginning to revolt. Let him speak and let's hear what he has to say. Imam Zainul Abidin goes atop the minbar and he says, Ana ibn Makkah wa Mina. If you have forgotten who I am, let me explain to you who I am. I am the child of Mecca and Mina. I am the child of Rasulullah. I am the child of that prophet who was brought to you and then who was raised back unto Allah. أنا ابن من دنا فتدلى فقاب قوسين أو أدنى. I am the child of that person who was brought close towards Allah. I am the child of a person who was killed within the plains of Karbala. My father was Hussain, who was killed in those lands, and his body was left in those lands of Karbala. Did we deserve to be dishonored in this way? It is said that the adhan would begin. They were trying to cut off the words of Imam Zainul Abidin. And then it said أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. It is said that the call, I bear witness that Muhammad is Rasulullah. Imam Zainul Abidin said, is this Muhammad your father or is this my father? Is this your grandfather or is this my grandfather? If it is my grandfather, then why did we deserve this honor? وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. ماتم Hussain.
They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. Every day it cuts me inside. I'm so very far from your side. I would give away these eyes just to catch a glimpse of your shrine. If I have to cross the seas and every desert in between, I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I can tell you that I'm insane in the love of my master Hussain. In this universe there's no pain that can ever keep me away. Every inch that I come your way, every beat of my heart will say, I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. If I lose my family and friends, and my life's coming to an end, if I lose my feet and hands, if I can no longer stand, if I stumble 1,000 times, if the journey's 1,000 miles, I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. You just have to look at this world, see your lovers are tortured and hurt. They can use their tanks and their guns. We will stand together as one. They can tear us limb from limb, but our soul will say from within, I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. This is now my state, oh Hussain. I'm so overwhelmed Who can I turn to and explain all the grief that my heart now contains? Who can I now call for help? Pinning all my hopes on yourself, I will come crawling to you, Hussain. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. They can cut my arms and my legs. They can take everything that I have. I will come crawling to you, Hussain. So,
Can stand for ziyarat. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam wa laka salam wa ilayka ya'udu salam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alayka ayyuha an-nabiyyu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu ala al-a'immat al-hadin al-mahdiyyin. Assalamu ala jami' anbiya'illahi wa rusulihi wa malaikatihi. Assalamu alayna wa ala ibadillahi as-salihin. Assalamu ala aliyin amir al-mu'minin. Assalamu ala Fatimata az-Zahra sayyidati nisa'i al-alamin. Assalamu ala al-Hasan wal-Hussain sayyidai shababi ahli al-jannati ajma'in. Assalamu ala Ali ibn al-Hussain Zain al-Abidin. Assalamu ala Muhammad ibn Ali baqir ilm al-nabiyyin. Assalamu ala Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq. Assalamu ala Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim. Assalamu ala Ali ibn Musa al-Ridha. Assalamu ala Muhammad ibn Ali al-Jawad. Assalamu ala Ali ibn Muhammad al-Hadi. Assalamu ala al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Zaki al-Askari. Assalamu ala al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Qa'im al-Mahdi. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله مخرجه وجعلنا من أعوانه وأنصاره وشيعته والمستشهدين بين يديه. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.